paradise is removed, so she jumps off and crashes into the rocks and commits suicide, which is probably a good thing at this point. He shows up and then reclaims his kingdom. He plants these 3 golden apples, and from out of that grows this enormous tree of bounteous futility, which guarantees that his reign will be even more glorious and wonderful than that of his parents. And the little footnote says he becomes the eponymous founder of the Irish community of Connacht. So he may be based on a historical person. So that's the Celtic tale, and Zimmer remarks, he says the first thing is to notice is that in order for Khan Ada to inherit the throne and rule effectively, he has to go through a transformation ritual that's a little bit like the rituals of initiation that adolescents are put through in primitive societies. There has to be contact with the dark side of life. He has to get his hands dirty, in other words. He has to learn about injustice. And if he's going to be the ruler and embody forth the principle of order, he must learn chaos. And not only that, but he must also learn how to go with the forces of nature. And he says the overriding point about the story, if you'll notice, is this wonderful trust that he has in the forces of nature. He does everything the horse tells him to do, and it leads him exactly right through the adventure. And Zimmer says this is analogous to listening to your instincts and your intuition, which, if you listen to them, will guide you through life, just as, and that's the symbolism of him letting go of the reins of the horse. This is a classical medieval motif you find in a lot of these stories, and the rider of the horse symbolizes, you know, the ego, the intellect, and the horse symbolizes the vehicle of the body and the instincts. And letting go of the reins indicates that you are submitting to the guidance of the non-rational forces in nature. And Zimmer says this is why he becomes such a great king and why he is fit to rule so well, is because of his trust in the non-rational forces of nature. And they just carry him right along, and just as we are carried along through our lives. The Celts really had, it's a Celtic story, and the Celts really have, though they were Indo-Aryans, they really did have a wonderful sense of the bountiful wonder of nature, of just trusting in nature. You find in all these Celtic fairy tales, and this one was taken from Yeats's collection of fairy tales, you find this wonderful trust in these powers of nature. And that's about it as far as Zimmer goes. Does anybody have any comments at all? Anything?
About the story?
Yes.
Well, I don't know, I'm Irish, but I mean, they always had these jokes about, you know, how the fairies were dancing around and nobody would notice.
Yes.
And you had to kind of get with the program, and that usually involved a lot of drink and a lot of time by yourself off in the hills somewhere.
Yes. Yes, the Celts are a lot like the Germans in that sense. They have a very, the Irish, I should say, they have a very, the culture is very mystical and very much in tune with these great esoteric traditions. And Celtic Christianity would have been, I'm convinced, a magnificent edifice if it had survived the invasions of the Vikings. It would have been just a, I mean, if you look at the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Kells, I mean, their understanding of how the symbols work in terms of the Hermetic tradition, these monks really picked it up. I mean, they were amazing. It would have been a great counterplayer to the Catholic Church if they had survived, but they didn't. But the tradition does become the foundation of all the Arthurian romances. All the Arthurian romances are essentially transformations of the Celtic stories. They change the names, but they're basically the same characters, and they bring in this sort of Christian, this external Christian armor, but it's totally external. The spirit of the stories is Celtic. The Grail is based on an old Celtic. You remember when he picks up the iron ball, there's a cup there that he picks up. And the cup is never used in the story. I wondered about that, but the cup itself later becomes the Grail. And you find this cup motif, and particularly through all these Celtic stories, you find the cup or a dish or a source of inexhaustibility, and all this fecundity and life and wonder comes out of this inexhaustibly. And this represents, later it's taken up as the Grail, and it represents the source of the energies of eternity that just come pouring into time. In the Hindu tradition, it's that center, the causal zone of deep dreamless sleep, from out of which the dreams come. It's that center within us that these myths teach us how to contact. Yes?
Well, there's always also a thing with like the poetic hero and the Lady of the Lake.
Yes.
Vivian.
Yes.
And it's all subconscious, and it's all Merlin, and it's, you know, druids and ogres and things. So it's pretty rich.
Yes. And I like this story particularly. What I see in it is and you find this in a lot of the European stories. The European, you find a lot of cultures tend to think of Europeans as newcomers, and really we're not, because the oldest culture in the world dates to the Neanderthals, and that's all European. And then you get the great caves of Lascaux and Les Trois Frères. That's all in France and Spain, and you hear echoes of these earlier mythologies, these earlier historical levels in all the myths and tales that come out of Europe. And in this story in particular, do you remember the motif where the horse says, here's the knife, cut me and wear my skin? That's basically a very late echo of a mythology that goes clear back to the Paleolithic. And it's the myth of the hunter and the idea of the covenant. There's a wonderful Native American story that Joseph Campbell used to tell that is probably, and it's very possible that it's the same myth going all the way back to the Paleolithic, and because of the conservatism of these oral traditions that's passed along. You can't change things. And so the story goes, in this version, it's called The Buffalo's Wife. And apparently it was the tradition of the Native Americans one way to kill the buffalo was have them all run over this cliff. Well, one year they weren't running over the cliff. They would run up to the precipice and then divert. And so it looked like the people were going to starve. This is a Blackfoot myth, by the way. So this one girl, Minnie Ha Ha perhaps was her name, she goes up to the sort of edge and she kind of sings this song and says, if only you would all come over, I would marry one of you. And so the buffalo come pouring over in this huge cascading torrent, smashing and breaking their backs, and this gigantic massacre. Except for this one magical buffalo, the sort of animal master, as it's called. He stands up and he can switch back and forth kind of between a human and an animal form, or an animal with human characteristics. And he comes over and grabs her and says, off we go. And the father wakes up, her father, one morning. He says, well, now where's Minnie Ha Ha? And he's a good hunter, and he sniffs around and he finds the footprints, and he realizes that she's been kidnapped. So he goes off on a quest to find her, and he goes wandering out, and he happens to cross this magpie that alights, and he asks the magpie, he says, by the way, I'm looking for my daughter. She ran off with a buffalo. You don't happen to have heard anything about that? And the magpie says, yes, as a matter of fact, they're over here. I'll take you right over. So he follows the magpie, and the magpie takes him over to the buffalo camp, and he says, he tells the magpie, would you go in there and tell my daughter that I'm out here, and I've come for her now? So the magpie goes fluttering in. In the meantime, inside the buffalo residence, the buffalo breaks off his horn, and he gives it to the girl, and he says, here, go get me some water. Now, that's an interesting image, because I don't know if any of you have seen from the Paleolithic the image of the Venus of Lazelle holding the horn up, and the horn has, it looks like a buffalo horn, and may very well be, and it has 13 slashes across it, which suggest half a cycle of the moon, and she's rubbing her belly with her other hand, suggesting a connection with the menstrual cycle and with the moon, and the possibility of the moon to regenerate itself eternally, just as the great mother womb of the goddess pours forth fecundity as these animal herds that just keep coming in. You kill them off, and they keep coming out. So it's possible that this connects all the way back with this Paleolithic myth. So she goes to the well and fills it up with water, and there's Daddy. And he says, look, I've come from you, let's go. She says, no, let me take care of it. If we leave, they'll kill you. I mean, look at this, a whole herd of buffalo. And he says, well, okay, what should we do about it? She says, let me take care of it. She goes back, gives the buffalo his horn. He drinks out of it, and then he sniffs it, and he says, I think I smell an Indian. And she says, oh, no, it's just me. And she says, no, he says, I definitely smell an Indian. So he gets up, and he and all of his buddies get up, and they go over, and they find the father, and they kill him. They just trample him to death and stamp him into the dirt. And then she's over here screaming and crying, and he comes back over to her, and he says, well, what's the matter? And he says, well, it was my father. And he says, well, now you know how we feel when the buffalo come pouring over every year to suit your needs. And he says, but I'll tell you what, apparently he was a sort of compassionate buffalo. He said, I'll tell you what, if you can bring your father back to life, I'll let the both of you go. And she says, okay, I think I can do that. So she goes to the magpie and says, would you go over there and find a little piece of Daddy? So the magpie flies over and picks up a vertebrae, brings it back to her, and she puts it underneath this blanket, it's probably a buffalo skin, puts it underneath it, and she starts singing a little song. And this little form starts growing under it. She looks under,